Welcome to my channel. You are watching Casual DIY. In today's video I want to present you a jig from Trend, the CDJ300 Dovetail Jig. Now it does come with one basic plate, however you can order different types of plates to do different kinds of joints, but we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, rather heavy box actually. Let's get it unpacked, set it up, and we'll see how easy or hard it's actually to make those type of joints. Right, so what have we got in the box? Obviously the manual, that will come in handy, a router bit, two clamping bars, and you do have this material on them. It's like sandpaper, just to make sure that your boards stay in the place they need to be. A router collet, a lot of bits and pieces, for star knobs. In the box as standard you also get the lapped dovetail template itself, that's a 1/2 inch one. And finally the main body of the jig itself, and tell you what, that weighs an absolute ton. Now with the whole set you actually do get a spanner and some Allen keys, so more or less you all sorted. First of all, what we're gonna do is to install a bolt like this, a nut, a washer, and a wing nut like this. Now it's a double set, so we're gonna have one on one side and the other one on the other side. This basically will allow us to attach the template and to make sure it's in the right place. The bolt itself screws in just like so. Then you add the nut. It's one of those nylon nuts, okay, so it does have the insert, so this may take a few minutes. Now the washer and the wing nut. Same setup on the other side. Now let's install the top clamp. On the back, just over here, you've got threaded holes, so that's for the large star knobs over here. So how do you put this together? First of all, a spring, then the clamp, then a washer, and at the end, the star knob. Just like so. Make sure that rough material that's just over here, that is facing the jig itself. And in the same way we're going to install the front clamp. Now we need to install 4 positive stops. These stops, they need to go on the inner screw holes, okay? So you do have 4 screws. I'm going to whack them inside just like so and just drive them in. As I say, we are using the inner screw holes. The other set is used for a different template. Now these templates, according to the manual, come in some sort of a protective oil coating, so we need to remove that before we're actually going to continue. A bit of spirit should do the job. Now it's time to install the L-shaped brackets onto our template. And with that done, we can install our template onto the jig itself. And there you go, that's the jig assembled. Well, almost. What the instruction says, it does say that we need to create a base for this. That, well, they actually do provide wood screws for it, so you can use MDF, plywood, or any sheet good material you want. And basically that will allow you to clamp this jig down to your workbench in a nice and steady manner, as it is crucial and super important that this jig stays in place, doesn't move, doesn't wobble. Okay, so you are operating a router and you need to be safe. And to be safe, this needs to be stable. And for this very reason, I've got this piece of 18mm laminated chipboard. Now, I went with additionally 10 centimeters over the edges of the jig itself. So in total, it comes to, let me just check, 68 centimeters. Right, so let's mount this on. Now, one thing you need to be careful of is to make sure that the jig itself, this side, it's actually not flush with your base, okay? That base, it needs to be sticking out past the base you're going to be having from MDF, melamine or anything else, just to make sure that your workpiece will not be touching the base itself as you're going to be offering it to the jig itself. Okay, so very important, make sure the jig itself is sticking past the edge of your board. Okay, I've established the position of the jig on the board itself. Okay, I've got a bit of a lip here. What we're going to do, we're going to remove the template itself. And on the top of the jig, you got 4 holes. And basically, that's where the screw hole will go. So I'm just using a pin to mark the location of the screws. And over here, you've got the place to put your screw in. And from the top, you can just use a screwdriver to drive in the screw. There you go, easy peasy. I'm just going to carry on with the remaining 3 screws. And now what's left to do is to clamp down the jig itself to your workbench to make sure it's in a nice and stable position. And that's definitely not moving anywhere. Now, assembly of the whole jig itself, as you can see, is absolutely straightforward, no issues with that. So let's see how easy or hard it's actually to set this up for your first cut. Let's have a go. Okay, so the jig is fully assembled, it's attached to my workbench. Now, what I want to do is to install the router bit that comes with the set onto my router. Now, make sure that you pick a router or you use a router that does have fine adjustment of depth, as you're definitely going to need for this process. Now, this jig itself, you know, the quality of the cuts will be dictated by how you set up the jig. Now, it's not a magical thing that you just whack into boards and everything does itself automatically. There's actually a process that you need to follow to make sure it is accurate. Today, I'm just going to skim over and show you how more or less to use the jig. However, in a separate video, I'm going to go into very fine details of how to tune this jig up, and we're going to make a box basically, as it is a process that you need to follow. Now, on the base of my router, I'm also going to install the guide bush that comes with the set. Okay, the router is now ready. Now, there are 2 main adjustments you can do with the jig and the router itself. Okay, so for example, if the connection is too loose, that means you need to increase the depth of the cut. So that's the responsibility of the router itself. And obviously on the other side, if it's too tight, you need to decrease the depth of cut. Now, when it comes to the jig itself, to the comb itself, if the joint is too shallow, so basically the tails are sticking out, you need to move the comb itself in, okay, inside of the jig. And vice versa, if the tails are too far in, you move the comb out. Now, that may seem quite easy, but actually to dial it in super precise and super correct, you will need a couple of attempts, regardless if you're going to set up everything perfectly. Sometimes, you know, a fine adjustment needs to be done. So before you actually jump into cutting your boxes, have some spare, have some scrap wood lying about that's the same thickness and hopefully more or less the same material as you're going to use for your box to actually try the setup out before you commit to the main cut. Now, as you know, we've got the stop pins on both sides. So if you're making a box, first two, the front and one side, you do on the left, and the other two pieces you need to cut on the right, so everything matches together. But as I say, don't worry, I'm gonna make a full dedicated video to how to set this up so you know exactly the step-by-step process. Right, we've got two pieces of timber, one will be sitting on the top of the jig and one butting against it at the front of the machine. And we will be cutting the standard 1/2 inch lap dovetails. And to do that on one piece, at least according to the manual, we need to score a line that's 15mm in. And that's the piece that's on top of the jig where we're going to be cutting out the slots. And at the same time we can set up the depth of our router bit, and that needs to be, according to the manual, 17mm. Okay, now it's time to set up the jig itself, the comb position. Now, you remember, we do have this line on this piece of timber, and that line needs to align with the end of our comb, just over here. First of all, I'm going to whack in the vertical board, okay? Remember, we do have a pin here and that needs to be butting against it. And at this stage, that piece will go above the line of the bottom of the jig itself. And with the clamps, I'm just going to clamp it down, okay? So it's against the pin and now it's in a stable position. At this point, I'm actually going to remove the comb, as I want to show you that's the second pin where this piece needs to go against, like so. And as you can see, we do have a space between both of these boards, and that will allow us to have nice and flush connection when everything's cut out. So this piece is butting against this one, so I can lock it in place now with the clamp. Now we need to set up the comb. As you remember, we do have the line just over here on that piece, and that line needs to correspond to those, okay? So let me put in the comb. And at this point, I can't really see the line on our piece of timber, so we need to adjust the jig itself. And to adjust the distance of the comb, we do have those nuts on each side. One full revelation is 1mm further away. So let's adjust the nut. Obviously, you need to do it on both sides, otherwise your cut will not be straight. Let me just check if it's in the right position now. If I can see the line. No, I still need to go a little bit further. Yes, so I can see the line now. That's perfect position. And I need to make the same adjustment on the other side. Now what you can do to help yourself out just a little bit to make sure you're in the alignment correctly, you can do two things. Either you move both of the pieces to the other side to make sure this side is correct, or what I did, you can also measure the distance from the middle of the comb on each side, and if the distances are the same, you should be fine. As for the second alignment, that board needs to be flush with the top of this one, okay? So I'm just going to loosen this up a little bit. And the best tool for this is just a nice square. Put it against it. Make sure we're in the right position. Always make sure you're against the pins as well. Perfect. Now don't expect perfect results at the first try and the first setup. There's many variables here that could, well, go wrong. Hence it's super important to actually have sacrificial pieces to try the joint out first to see how it comes out. And as I said before, if the joint itself is too loose or too tight, that's the router responsible for that, so the height of the router bit. However, if the tails are too far in or too far out, then we need to adjust the jig itself. So let's go and see what results we're gonna get. Okay, let's take the pieces out of the jig itself and see what kind of joinery we managed to cut out. Right, let's have a look. Well, in my opinion, it's definitely way too tight, okay? However, the sides are nice and flush and overall the joinery is fine, but it is way too tight. So I'm going to change the position of the route a bit. I'm just going to cut off the ends here and we'll have another go. Okay, let's have a look what we've got. Now it's too loose. So all in all, we do get really nice joint, nice and clean. You know, it's nice and level to the edges, but it's all about dialing in the setup. So I increased it by 1 millimeter, and it's a little bit too loose now. So probably if I went with 0.5 millimeter, that would be absolutely perfect. So it's all about adjustment. And plus, as you can see, it definitely went too deep as well. So we need to adjust the jig itself. So yeah, that's why it's super important to try out on some pieces before you actually commit to your main cut. On the inside, nice and tight corner there, so no issues with that. So as you can see, this jig is not a magical jig that on its own without no preparation will let you cut absolutely perfect lap dovetails out of the box. You do need to spend a bit of time and preparation before you actually can cut absolutely tight, beautiful dovetails. And with this jig, that's absolutely possible. However, as I said, preparation is the key. And that's why I want to take you in full detail video and messing around basically, so you can see all the errors and how to fix them. So when you finally set this up, it will be no issues to use it. And when you do set it up, it will remain as that for all the joints. So you don't have to do it for every single cut. Yeah, of course, if you change the thickness of the material, you need to run the tests again. But if you're using the same thickness material, you know, there's no messing around with that. Same when it comes to the width of the board. In my case, as you can see, I've got a perfect balanced amount of pins, and the edges are coming out on closed pins. However, you do have to do the math as well, and the instructions do help you out to make sure that, you know, the width of the material is actually appropriate for this type of jig and will give you a good amount of pins, so they actually look nice and clean. However, the quality of the jig overall is actually very good, and in a way it is simple to use. You know, there's no hidden things, it's not complicated. It's a bit of a trial and error to dial it in correctly, and you can do that fairly easily. Don't forget, another video with this is coming, so make sure to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss that video if you're new here. And yeah, I will be covering this jig in far more detail. We're gonna put a box together and you'll see on my errors or my tries how to set this up correctly step by step in great detail if you want to have a jig like this, and that will give you the knowledge to make less errors on your own. However, before that happens, I do have some really cool playlists just over here for you. Plenty of fantastic videos when it comes to workshop projects, woodworking, DIY, and everything in between. So click on those and hopefully I'll see you on one of those videos there. Take care.